Marcus tended his sprawling community garden with calloused hands, secretly leaving boxes of fresh produce on a struggling family's doorstep each week. Despite his own modest pension, he couldn't bear watching young children go hungry in his neighborhood. For 6 months, he maintained this quiet act of kindness until one morning when a sleek SUV pulled up to his garden gate. 2 executives stepped out, holding documents that would transform not just his life, but the entire community. Little did Marcus know that his simple acts of generosity would blossom into something beyond his wildest dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late August sun had barely risen over the horizon when Marcus Chen carefully made his way through the rows of his meticulously maintained community garden. At 72, his steps were slower than they used to be, but his expertise in coaxing life from the earth hadn't diminished. The 3-acre plot on the corner of Maple and Harrison Streets had been his sanctuary since retiring from his career as a high school biology teacher 5 years ago. The morning dew still clung to the leaves of towering tomato plants, heavy with ripening fruit. Rainbow chard sparkled in the early light, while neat rows of carrots and potatoes waited beneath the rich soil he had spent years nurturing. Marcus had transformed what was once an abandoned lot into a verdant oasis in their working-class neighborhood of Pine Valley. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he harvested the day's bounty. 2 large wicker baskets slowly filled with fresh vegetables, perfectly ripe tomatoes, crisp cucumbers, tender green beans, and fragrant herbs. Most of the produce would go to the local farmer's market where he sold his vegetables at modest prices, helping to cover the garden's maintenance costs and supplementing his teacher's pension. But the finest specimens went into a separate box. The sweetest tomatoes, the most tender lettuce, the crispest bell peppers. These weren't for sale. Marcus glanced at his watch, noting it was nearly 7. He needed to finish his special delivery before the Henderson family woke up. The first time he had noticed them was during the spring parent-teacher conference at Pine Valley Elementary, where he still volunteered as a science club mentor. Lisa Henderson had brought her 3 children, Emma, age 10, Michael, age 8, and little Sarah, just 6. They had caught his attention not because they were disruptive, but because of their unusual quietness. As a veteran teacher, Marcus recognized the signs of hunger in their hollow cheeks and tired eyes. He had overheard Lisa talking quietly with the school counselor about her husband's recent layoff from the manufacturing plant that had employed half the town. Medical bills from Sarah's chronic asthma had depleted their savings, and the family was struggling to make ends meet while Tom Henderson searched for work in an increasingly automated industry. That evening, Marcus couldn't sleep. The image of those children, reminding him so much of the students he had taught for 4 decades, haunted him. The next morning, he began leaving weekly boxes of fresh produce on the Hendersons' porch before dawn, ring the doorbell, and hurry away before anyone could see him. Now 6 months later, Marcus smiled as he arranged the vegetables in a sturdy cardboard box. He had watched from a distance as the children's faces gradually regained their color. He occasionally overheard Lisa at the grocery store, telling friends how blessed they were that someone was leaving them fresh vegetables, how it helped them afford Sarah's medications. The family had even started their own small container garden on their apartment balcony, inspired by their mysterious benefactor. Marcus kept his identity secret, understanding that sometimes pride makes accepting help difficult. He remembered his own childhood in Taiwan, when his family had relied on the kindness of neighbors during hard times. His father had always said that help given quietly honors both the giver and receiver. The morning air was starting to warm as Marcus placed the box on the Hendersons' doorstep, his joints protesting as he straightened up. He had just turned to leave when he noticed an unfamiliar SUV parking across the street. 2 people stepped out, a man and woman in business attire, looking distinctly out of place in their working-class neighborhood. They seemed to be watching him with unusual interest. Marcus hurried away, his heart pounding. In 4 decades of teaching and 5 years of gardening, he had learned to trust his instincts about people. Something about these strangers suggested that his simple morning routine was about to become considerably more complicated. The familiar scent of damp earth and growing things welcomed Marcus back to his garden. By 8 o'clock, the summer sun had risen high enough to burn away the morning mist, and the first bees were beginning their careful inspection of the flowering zucchini plants. Marcus settled into his daily routine, trying to shake off his unease about the mysterious observers. His garden was divided into neat sections, each carefully planned to maximize both yield and beauty. The north side held tall structures for climbing plants, sweet peas, pole beans, and his prize-winning heirloom tomatoes that had earned him local fame at the Pine Valley Farmers Market. The central beds burst with leafy greens, root vegetables, and herbs, while the southern edge bloomed with flowers that attracted beneficial insects and added splashes of color to his vegetable bouquets. The garden shed, painted a cheerful blue that matched the morning glories climbing its walls, held all of his essential tools. Each implement had its place, organized with the precision of someone who had spent decades teaching teenagers the importance of scientific methodology. Marcus checked his weather-beaten notebook where he tracked plantings, harvests, and his weekly deliveries to the Henderson family. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," called a voice from the garden gate. Marcus looked up to see Jenny Wu, one of his former students, who now helped him at the farmer's market on weekends. She was pursuing her degree in agricultural science at the State University, inspired partly by the after-school gardening club he had run at Pine Valley High. "Jenny, you're early today," he smiled, noting how she automatically began checking the irrigation lines, a task he found increasingly difficult with his arthritis. "The market doesn't start for 3 hours. Thought you might need extra help with the heirloom tomatoes," she replied, adjusting her sun hat. "They're really coming in now, and I know Thursday is your busy morning." She paused, then added with careful casualness, "I noticed you had quite a few vegetables set aside in the special box this morning." Marcus kept his expression neutral. Jenny had never directly asked about the boxes of premium produce he prepared each week, but he knew she had figured out their destination. She had grown up in the same apartment complex as the Hendersons, and had subtly begun planting extra rows of Sarah's favorite sugar snap peas without comment. "The garden has been generous this year," he replied, his standard response to any questions about his morning deliveries. He busied himself with checking the tomato plants, remembering how his own mother had taught him that true kindness never draws attention to itself. As they worked, Marcus's thoughts drifted to his late wife, Mai, who had shared his passion for nurturing growing things. She had been the one to suggest turning this abandoned lot into a community garden after his retirement. "You need a place to grow more than just vegetables," she'd told him, understanding how much he would miss his students. Though she hadn't lived to see the garden flourish, her influence touched every corner of it. The morning progressed with the familiar rhythm of garden tasks. Marcus and Jenny harvested vegetables for the market, arranged them in attractive displays, and prepared the signs that would show today's prices, always kept deliberately affordable for their working-class neighborhood. They checked on the community plots where local families grew their own produce, offering quiet advice when asked, but mostly letting people learn through experience, just as he had done in his classroom. Yet Marcus couldn't quite focus on his usual tasks. His thoughts kept returning to the mysterious observers from earlier. Had they followed him from the Hendersons' house? Were they somehow connected to the family? He had heard rumors that the manufacturing plant might be reopening under new management. Could they be involved with that? As he helped Jenny load crates into her small truck for the market, he noticed the same black SUV driving slowly past the garden. This time, he caught a glimpse of the woman in the passenger seat holding what looked like a camera. Before he could process this strange detail, they had driven away, leaving him with an increasing sense that his carefully tended routine was about to face an unexpected disruption. "Mr. Chen?" Jenny's voice broke into his thoughts. "Is everything okay? You seem distracted today." Marcus managed a reassuring smile. "Just thinking about the weather," he said, glancing at the cloudless sky. "We might need to adjust the irrigation schedule if this heat continues." "But As they finished their morning preparations, he couldn't shake the feeling that, like the seeds he planted each spring, something significant was taking root, something that would change more than just his garden. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon sun beat down on the garden as Marcus took his customary break in the shade of his favorite apple tree. From this spot, he had a clear view of Pine Valley Elementary School across the street, where children were spilling out into the playground for recess. His eyes automatically found the Henderson children among them, Emma's dark ponytail bouncing as she played jump rope, Michael showing his friends something on the playground, and little Sarah sitting quietly under a tree with a book. Sarah's presence especially caught his attention today. Unlike her more energetic siblings, she moved carefully, conscious of the inhaler she always carried in her pocket. Marcus remembered the day last spring when he'd been volunteering with the science club, showing the children how to start seedlings when Sarah had suffered an asthma attack. The fear in her eyes had struck a chord deep within him, reminding him of his own daughter's childhood struggles with respiratory issues before they'd found the right treatment. The medical bills from that incident had been the final straw for the Henderson family's finances. Tom Henderson, a skilled machinist with 20 years of experience, had already been struggling to find work after Pine Valley Manufacturing closed its doors. The plant's shutdown had sent shockwaves through the community, leaving hundreds of families like the Hendersons scrambling to rebuild their lives. Lisa Henderson worked part-time at the local library, but her salary barely covered their rent in the aging apartment complex 2 blocks from the garden. Marcus had overheard her talking to the librarian about taking on extra shifts, about the challenge of affording both groceries and Sarah's medications. Her voice had held that particular tone he recognized from his years of teaching, the sound of a parent trying to stay strong while watching their children go without. The family's pride touched something deep in Marcus's heart. They never complained, never asked for help. Lisa still volunteered at school events, Tom spent his free time helping neighbors with repairs, and the children remained unfailingly polite despite their circumstances. They reminded Marcus of his own family's struggles when they first immigrated to America, of the quiet dignity his parents had maintained even in their hardest times. A commotion from the playground drew his attention. Sarah was showing her classmates something, a container garden she'd created for the science fair, featuring the same types of vegetables that mysteriously appeared on her family's doorstep each week. Marcus smiled, remembering how Jenny had mentioned that the Henderson children had been asking questions about container gardening at the farmer's market. "Your garden has quite a view," a voice said, startling Marcus from his thoughts. He turned to find the woman from the SUV standing at his garden gate, her business attire looking out of place among the vegetable beds. Up close, he could see she was probably in her 40s, with kind eyes that reminded him of Mai. "The children remind me why I started this garden," Marcus replied carefully, noting how her gaze moved between him and the school playground. "There's something special about watching things grow." "Including people?" she asked, her tone meaningful. Before Marcus could respond, the school bell rang, calling the children back to class. Sarah waved toward the garden as she walked inside, not at Marcus specifically, but at the space itself, as if thanking it for some secret gift. The woman watched this interaction with interest. "Mr. Chen, my name is Catherine Martinez. I'm the Director of Community Development for Green Future Enterprises." She handed him a business card with a familiar logo, the same company that had recently purchased the old manufacturing plant. "I was wondering if we could talk about your garden, and particularly about your Thursday morning deliveries." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. In all these months, no one had directly addressed his early morning routine. He looked at Catherine more carefully, noticing now that despite her corporate appearance, her hands bore the slight calluses of someone who knew their way around a garden. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private," he suggested, gesturing toward his garden shed. As they walked, he noticed Tom Henderson across the street, leaving another unsuccessful job interview judging by his slumped shoulders. The sight strengthened Marcus's resolve. Whatever this woman wanted, he wouldn't let it interfere with helping this family. Inside the shed, surrounded by the tools of his passion, Marcus felt more grounded. Catherine looked around with apparent interest at his carefully organized space, her eyes lingering on the planting schedules and delivery notes pinned to the wall. "You run quite an operation here," she observed. "Commercial agriculture background?" 40 years teaching high school biology, Marcus corrected. The garden came after retirement, though some might say I'm still teaching, just with different materials. Catherine smiled at that. "That's exactly what brings me here today, Mr. Chen. We've been watching how you've cultivated more than just vegetables in this community. But before we continue, I need to ask, how much do you know about vertical farming?" Marcus studied Catherine's business card, turning it over in his weathered hands as the afternoon sun filtered through the garden shed's small window. The green Future Enterprises logo gleamed on the premium cardstock, a stylized plant growing from what looked like a circuit board. The contrast between the corporate polish of the card and the earthy simplicity of his shed struck him as almost comical. "Vertical farming?" he repeated, buying time to gather his thoughts. "I've read about it in agricultural journals. Growing food in controlled environments, usually in urban settings. Multiple levels of crops in climate-controlled buildings." He paused, looking directly at Catherine. "The kind of operation that could potentially fit into, say, an abandoned manufacturing plant?" Catherine's eyes sparkled with appreciation for his quick understanding. "Exactly. Green Future Enterprises specializes in converting defunct industrial spaces into state-of-the-art vertical farming facilities. We combine traditional agricultural knowledge with modern technology to create sustainable urban food production." She pulled out a tablet from her leather briefcase, displaying images of vast indoor growing spaces. Rows of leafy greens flourishing under LED lights, automated systems monitoring moisture levels, workers in clean uniforms harvesting vegetables year-round. "We are preparing to convert the Pine Valley manufacturing plant into our newest facility. But we're not just interested in the building. We're interested in the community." Marcus felt his throat tighten. The plant's closure had devastated Pine Valley, and its potential reopening, even in a different form, could mean everything to families like the Hendersons. Yet something about this situation made him cautious. "And my garden factors into this? How?" "We've been studying successful community integration models," Catherine explained, swiping to a new image on her tablet. "Most vertical farming operations struggle to connect with their communities. They're seen as too corporate, too removed from traditional farming. But you," she gestured to the garden beyond the shed's windows, "you've created something special here, a bridge between traditional growing methods and community needs." Through the window, Marcus could see Jenny helping a group of children from the after-school program harvest carrots, teaching them to gently wiggle the greens rather than pulling straight up. The kids' excited voices carried across the garden as they discovered the orange treasures hidden in the soil. "We've been watching your operation for several weeks," Catherine continued. "Your farming techniques are impressive, but what really caught our attention was your Thursday morning routine." She held up a hand as Marcus stiffened. "Don't worry. We admire what you're doing. In fact, it aligns perfectly with our community outreach goals." Marcus thought carefully before responding. Years of teaching had taught him that the first answer wasn't always the best one. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Martinez?" "Catherine, please," she smiled. "We'd like to offer you a position as our community agriculture liaison. You'd help us integrate our vertical farming operation with local needs, teach traditional growing methods to our staff, and help us develop programs to support food-insecure families in the community, like the Hendersons." The mention of the family's name made Marcus's garden-calloused hands clench slightly. "You've done thorough research." "We believe in understanding the communities we enter," Catherine replied. "Pine Valley needs jobs, yes, but it also needs people who understand both the land and its people. People like you, Mr. Chen." Marcus stood up, needing to move. He walked to the shed's window, watching the children still delighting in their carrot harvest. Sarah Henderson had appeared at the garden fence after school, watching wistfully as her classmates learned gardening skills. He knew she couldn't join them due to her asthma's sensitivity to dust and pollen. The vertical farming facility would be climate-controlled, Catherine said softly, following his gaze. Clean air, no pollen. Every child could learn to grow food there, regardless of health issues. The possibility hung in the air between them, heavy with potential. Marcus thought about Tom Henderson's mechanical skills, currently going to waste, about Sarah's medical bills, about all the families in Pine Valley struggling to afford fresh produce. Yet he also thought about his garden's independence, the freedom to help others in his own quiet way. Corporate involvement, no matter how well-intentioned, would mean paperwork, oversight, committees deciding who deserved help and who didn't. I'll need time to think about this, he said finally, turning back to Catherine. She nodded, reaching into her briefcase again. Of course. Take all the time you need to review our proposal. She handed him a thick envelope. But, Mr. Chen, there's one more thing you should know about our plans for the plant. Something that might help you decide. As Catherine began to explain further, Marcus realized that his simple act of growing vegetables for a struggling family had planted seeds that were about to grow into something far beyond his small garden's borders. The next week proved to be one of the most challenging in Marcus's gardening career. Every morning, he continued his routine of tending to his plants and preparing the special delivery for the Henderson family, but Catherine's proposal weighed heavily on his mind. The thick envelope she'd left sat unopened on his kitchen table, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Thursday morning arrived with a symphony of birdsong and the gentle patter of early autumn rain. Marcus moved through his garden under the protection of his old green raincoat, harvesting vegetables with practiced efficiency, despite the weather. The rain made everything more difficult. Keeping produce dry, maintaining his footing on the increasingly muddy paths, protecting delicate tomatoes from splitting in the sudden moisture. Yet he persevered, knowing the Hendersons needed the fresh produce more than ever. He'd overheard Lisa at the grocery store the previous day, quietly putting back items as she calculated prices on her phone. Sarah's medical bills had increased again, and Tom's job search remained frustrating despite his decades of experience. As Marcus arranged the vegetables in his delivery box, he found himself paying even more attention to the selection than usual. The sweetest cherry tomatoes, the crispest lettuce, the most tender green beans, each chosen with the care of someone who understood that food could be more than just sustenance. It could be hope, served fresh from the earth. Jenny arrived earlier than normal, her college textbook tucked under her rain jacket. The farmer's market might be slow today, she said, helping him cover sensitive plants against the heavy rain. But I brought something to show you. She pulled out a marked-up copy of an article about vertical farming from her agricultural science journal. You've been researching, Marcus observed, noting the detailed annotations in the margins. Jenny nodded, her expression earnest. After you mentioned Catherine Martinez's visit, I wanted to understand more about what Green Future Enterprises does. Their technology is amazing, Mr. Chen. They use 95% less water than traditional farming, and their yields per square foot are incredible. Marcus listened as Jenny explained the technical details, remembering how she'd always been one of his most thorough students. She had the same look in her eyes now as she'd had in his biology class when discovering something exciting under the microscope. But that's not all, she continued, flipping to another marked page. They have this apprenticeship program for agricultural science students. Paid internships, hands-on experience with both traditional and modern farming methods. She hesitated, then added, and they prioritize local students who want to serve their communities. Marcus understood the unspoken message. Jenny's family, like many in Pine Valley, had struggled since the plant's closure. Her college scholarships covered tuition but left little for living expenses. An apprenticeship could change everything for her. The rain intensified as Marcus made his delivery to the Hendersons' doorstep. Through their kitchen window, he caught a glimpse of the family at breakfast. Tom was helping Sarah with her inhaler, while Lisa packed school lunches, likely containing sandwiches made with yesterday's vegetables. On their windowsill, small containers housed sprouting plants, their own attempt at growing hope. Back in his garden, Marcus finally reached for the envelope Catherine had left. Inside, he found detailed plans for Green Future's community integration program. The vertical farming facility would include a teaching center, where traditional gardening methods would be taught alongside modern techniques. There would be a subsidized produce program for families in need, and job training for former plant workers to transition into agricultural technology roles. But what caught his attention was a small note paper-clipped to the back page. "We believe in preserving what works while building what's needed. Your garden wouldn't have to change. It could be the bridge between old and new." As Marcus read through the proposals, his phone buzzed with a text from the school nurse. Sarah Henderson had suffered another asthma attack during morning recess. She was okay, but had been asking about the garden, wondering if she'd ever be able to help with the planting like her classmates. The pattern of Marcus's life, the quiet deliveries, the careful tending of his garden, the silent support of struggling families, had seemed simple and sufficient. But now he wondered if perhaps, like the vegetables he grew, it was time for something new to take root alongside the old. That evening, as Marcus prepared his garden for another night of rain, he noticed movement at the Hendersons' apartment. Tom was on their small balcony, carefully adjusting the plastic sheeting protecting their container plants from the rain, his mechanical expertise evident in the efficient setup. Marcus watched as Sarah joined her father, protected from the rain and pollen by their makeshift greenhouse, finally able to help tend their small garden without risking her health. The sight crystallized something in Marcus's mind. Sometimes growth required more than just natural rain and sunshine. Sometimes it needed innovation, protection, and the courage to try new methods alongside the trusted old ones. The weekend farmers market buzzed with its usual energy, but Marcus found himself watching the Henderson family more closely than usual. They had developed a routine over the past months, arriving early when the produce was freshest, but the prices hadn't yet been reduced for end-of-day sales. Tom would stand slightly apart, still uncomfortable with their circumstances, while Lisa and the children carefully selected vegetables from different vendors, making their limited budget stretch as far as possible. Today, though, something was different. Sarah carried a small pot proudly in her hands, containing a thriving basil plant from their balcony garden. She made her way directly to Marcus's stall, her siblings trailing behind with equal excitement. "Mr. Chen," Sarah called out, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. "Look what we grew. Jenny helped us set up the container just like you showed her in science club." She placed the pot on his table, the healthy plant a testament to careful tending. Marcus examined the basil with exaggerated seriousness, noting the strong stem and vibrant leaves. "Excellent work, Sarah. You have a natural talent for gardening." He glanced at her ever-present inhaler, then at the detailed growing instructions attached to the pot. Clearly Tom's mechanical precision at work, creating an environment his daughter could safely manage. Lisa approached the stall, her market basket already containing vegetables that looked suspiciously like the ones Marcus had delivered on Thursday. "Sarah hasn't stopped talking about growing things since she started her container garden," she said softly. "It's the first time she's found something she can do despite her asthma. The doctor says her breathing has actually improved since she started spending time with her plants on the balcony." The conversation was interrupted by Jenny's arrival at the stall. She carried a stack of flyers fresh from the university printer. "Mr. Chen, I hope you don't mind. I made these for your gardening workshops." She handed him one, the paper still warm. Marcus studied the flyer, noting how Jenny had incorporated photos of his garden alongside information about sustainable growing practices. At the bottom was a small note. "All workshops held in a pollen-controlled environment. Children with respiratory sensitivities welcome." "I thought..." Jenny glanced at Sarah, then back to Marcus. "Maybe we could start offering some sessions in the community center? The ventilation system there was recently upgraded. And I spoke with Catherine from Green Future. They're willing to provide air purifiers for the classes until their facility is ready." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. the same feeling he'd had years ago when making difficult decisions in his classroom. He looked at Sarah's hopeful face, then at Tom and Lisa's careful attempt to hide their own interest. The Henderson family's pride was still intact, but their walls were slowly lowering, allowing community support to reach them in new ways. "Actually," he said slowly, "I've been thinking about expanding the workshops. Perhaps." He met Tom's eyes. "We could use someone with mechanical experience to help design better container systems for indoor growing?" Tom straightened slightly, his expertise recognized. "I've been working on some ideas," he admitted. "Ways to maximize growing space in small areas, minimize dust and pollen, regulate water flow efficiently." His hands, idle for too long, moved as he spoke, sketching invisible designs in the air. Lisa watched her husband with quiet joy, seeing a spark of his old confidence returning. Marcus recognized that look. He'd seen it on Mai's face years ago, when he'd finally found his place in the classroom after struggling to adjust to life in America. The memory of Mai brought him back to their early days when they'd first arrived in Pine Valley. They'd had so little then, but their neighbors had helped in small ways. A shared meal here, hand-me-down clothes there, all offered with dignity and respect. Mai had always said that a community was like a garden. It needed both deep roots and new growth to thrive. As if reading his thoughts, Catherine appeared at the market stall. She'd traded her business attire for casual weekend clothes, but her presence still carried authority. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, taking in the scene. "I wanted to discuss some modifications to our proposal based on community feedback." Marcus noticed how she included everyone in her gaze. Not just him, but Jenny with her flyers, Tom with his engineering knowledge, Lisa with her careful resource management, and Sarah with her hard-won gardening success. Each person represented a different aspect of what Pine Valley needed: education, innovation, sustainability, resilience, and hope. "Perhaps," Marcus suggested, "we could discuss it over lunch? The cafe across the street makes excellent sandwiches." He paused, then added, with careful casualness, "They have a private room with good air filtration, plenty of space for anyone who'd like to join us." The invitation hung in the air, like a seed waiting to take root. Marcus watched as Tom and Lisa exchanged glances, as Sarah clutched her basil plant with excitement, as Jenny quickly calculated whether she could afford to join them. Before anyone could make excuses or retreat behind walls of pride, Catherine spoke up. "I believe Green Future Enterprises would benefit from hearing diverse community perspectives over lunch," she said smoothly, her corporate tone softening with genuine warmth. "My treat, of course, in exchange for your valuable time and insights." In that moment, Marcus saw the possible future taking shape. Not just a vertical farming facility, but a true community renaissance, growing from the seeds of kindness he'd planted months ago, with those first quiet deliveries of fresh vegetables. The cafe's private room hummed with conversation as lunch arrived. Marcus observed the unlikely gathering from his seat at the head of the table, Catherine with her tablet and professional demeanor, Jenny clutching her university notebook, Tom and Lisa Henderson sitting close together, their children occupied with coloring pages the cafe had provided. The room's air purifier hummed quietly in the background, allowing Sarah to breathe easily despite her condition. "Before we discuss the proposal," Catherine began, spreading out several documents, "I'd like to hear from each of you about your vision for Pine Valley's future." Her corporate polish had softened, replaced by genuine interest in the community's perspectives. Tom Henderson spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years at the old manufacturing plant. "When the plant closed, we lost more than jobs," he said, absently straightening his silverware with machinist's precision. "We lost our identity as a community. Everyone here had a purpose, a skill that mattered." Lisa touched his arm gently, adding, "But we've discovered new strengths. The way people help each other, even when they're struggling themselves." She glanced at Marcus, not mentioning the mysterious vegetable deliveries but acknowledging them silently. Jenny jumped in eagerly, her academic knowledge bubbling over. The vertical farming facility could combine both traditional manufacturing skills with sustainable agriculture. The systems need maintenance, calibration, monitoring. She trailed off, realizing she'd almost knocked over her water glass in her enthusiasm. Marcus watched Sarah carefully arranging her vegetables into patterns on her plate, remembering how Mai used to do the same thing, turning simple meals into art. "When I started the garden," he said slowly, "it was just a way to keep busy after retirement, to stay connected to teaching and growing things. I never imagined." "You never imagined it would grow into a community lifeline," Catherine finished. She pulled up images on her tablet. "That's exactly why Green Future wants to work with you, Mr. Chen. Our other facilities are efficient, productive, but they lack soul. They lack connection." The images showed sterile environments, workers in protective gear moving among towers of perfectly growing vegetables. Everything was precise, controlled, optimized. Marcus felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest, remembering how his own father had struggled when traditional farming methods gave way to mechanization in their village in Taiwan. "But there's a balance to be struck," Catherine continued, switching to new images. These showed community gardens integrated with high-tech growing systems, children learning alongside experts, traditional knowledge being preserved and enhanced by modern methods. "We don't want to replace what you've built, Mr. Chen. We want to help it evolve." Tom leaned forward, his engineer's mind engaged. "Those environmental control systems, they're similar to what we used in the plant's clean rooms. I could." He paused, decades of experience warring with months of rejection. "I could help maintain them, train others." "Exactly," Catherine nodded. "And Jenny's research into combining traditional and hydroponic methods could help us develop hybrid systems that are more resilient, more connected to local growing conditions." Sarah looked up from her plate where she'd arranged her vegetables into a perfect garden pattern. "Could I help too, even with my asthma?" The room fell quiet, every adult there understanding the weight of her question. In the old Pine Valley, Sarah's condition had limited her options. In the future, they were discussing, those limitations might not matter. "Everyone will be able to participate," Catherine assured her. "But," she turned to Marcus, "only if we do this right. Only if we maintain the balance between progress and tradition, between efficiency and community." Marcus felt the familiar tension between preservation and growth, the same conflict he'd faced when deciding to transform the abandoned lot into a garden. "My father," he said, his voice carrying memories of Taiwan, "used to say that the strongest plants are those that can bend in the wind without breaking." Lisa nodded, understanding. "Like our balcony garden. We're using Tom's engineering skills and traditional growing methods Sarah learned from your workshops. It's small, but it works." Typed. "That's what we want to create on a larger scale," Catherine explained. "A facility that combines the best of both worlds. But we need people who understand both perspectives, people who can help us maintain that balance." The conversation flowed more freely as lunch continued, barriers breaking down between corporate ambition and community needs. Tom sketched ideas on napkins, his mechanical expertise finding new purpose. Jenny shared research on community integration in agricultural projects, her academic knowledge grounded by practical experience in Marcus's garden. Lisa offered insights into making healthy food accessible to struggling families, while Sarah's questions about growing plants indoors sparked discussions about educational programs. Yet Marcus remained quiet, watching it all unfold. He saw the hope in Tom's renewed sense of purpose, the pride in Jenny's professional growth, the relief in Lisa's eyes at new possibilities for Sarah's future. But he also saw the challenges ahead, the delicate balance between progress and preservation, between helping people and maintaining their dignity. As the lunch meeting wound down, Catherine turned to him. "Mr. Chen, we need your answer soon. The facility renovations begin next month, and we need time to incorporate community elements into the design." Marcus looked around the table, seeing the future of Pine Valley reflected in every face. The decision he would make wouldn't just affect his garden or the Henderson family. It would shape the entire community's path forward. Word spread quickly through Pine Valley about the lunch meeting at the cafe. In a small town where the closure of the manufacturing plant had left deep wounds, any hint of new development traveled fast. By Monday morning, Marcus's garden had become an unofficial community gathering spot, with former plant workers and curious residents stopping by to ask questions. Marcus maintained his usual routine, carefully tending his plants while answering inquiries as best he could. Jenny had posted some of her flyers about the gardening workshops on the community bulletin board, and the response had been overwhelming. The community center's phone line was flooded with calls from people interested in learning both traditional and modern growing techniques. "It's not just about the jobs," explained Mike Patterson, a former plant supervisor who had stopped by to inspect Marcus's irrigation system. "It's about having a future here again, something to build on." He ran his hands along the carefully arranged watering tubes, his factory-trained eyes assessing their efficiency. "Tom Henderson told me about the environmental control systems they're planning. Sounds a lot like what we used to maintain in the clean rooms." Marcus nodded, remembering how the lunch discussion had energized Tom. "There's a need for experienced technicians who understand precision systems," he replied, carefully pruning a tomato plant. "Catherine mentioned they'll be starting training programs before the facility opens." A small crowd had gathered near the garden fence, where Jenny was explaining the basics of hydroponics to several interested former plant workers. She had set up a simple demonstration using materials from her university lab, showing how plants could grow without soil. Marcus noticed how she seamlessly connected traditional growing wisdom with modern techniques, just as she'd done in his biology class years ago. "But will it be real food?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez, who had run the plant's cafeteria for 15 years. She held up one of Marcus's tomatoes, comparing it to a store-bought one she'd brought. "Not just pretty vegetables without flavor?" "That's exactly why they need people like you and Mr. Chen," Jenny explained, "to help maintain quality and taste. It's not about replacing traditional methods. It's about combining them with new technology to grow more food, more efficiently, while keeping the quality." Sarah Henderson had arrived with her mother after school, clutching a project she'd made in science class. A detailed diagram showing how vertical farming worked. Her classmates gathered around as she explained the concept, her usual shyness forgotten in her excitement about something she could participate in despite her asthma. "See, there is filtered," she pointed to her drawing. "Just like in my dad's container garden design, and we can grow food all year round, even in winter." Her voice carried the wonder of someone who had discovered a world of new possibilities. Lisa watched her daughter with tears in her eyes. "I haven't seen her this excited about anything since before her asthma got worse," she confided to Marcus. "Yesterday, she told me she wants to be a botanical engineer when she grows up." I didn't even know that was a thing. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as more community members arrived. Marcus noticed how people who had barely spoken since the plant's closure were now engaged in animated conversations about the future. Former assembly line workers discussed adapting their skills to maintain hydroponic systems. The high school science teacher talked about developing a curriculum that would prepare students for jobs in agricultural technology. Catherine arrived later, having spent the day in meetings with town officials. She paused at the garden gate, taking in the scene of community engagement. "This is exactly what we hoped would happen," she told Marcus. "The facility isn't just about growing food, it's about growing community." As if to emphasize her point, Tom Henderson was demonstrating to a group of his former co-workers how he'd modified standard plumbing parts to create an efficient watering system for container gardens. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had found his expertise valued again. "We've had 67 people sign up for the initial training program," Catherine shared. "Most of them former plant workers. And the town council is discussing converting some vacant lots into community garden spaces, using your model of combining traditional and modern methods." Marcus thought about how she'd always said that a garden was more than just a place to grow vegetables. It was a place to grow connections. He watched as Mrs. Rodriguez handed out samples of salsa she'd made using his tomatoes, explaining to Catherine how important it was to maintain authentic flavors in the new facility. The garden had become more than just his retirement project. It had become a symbol of how Pine Valley could embrace change while preserving what mattered most: young and old, traditional and modern, all finding common ground among the vegetable beds and reimagining their community's future. As the evening approached, Marcus overheard Sarah explaining to her younger brother, "See, Michael, the vegetables Mr. Chen leaves on our porch every Thursday? Soon everyone will be able to have fresh food like that, and Dad will help build it, and Mom can teach cooking classes, and I can work there even with my asthma." Anne resigned. Her innocent revelation of his secret deliveries caught Marcus by surprise, but no one seemed shocked. Instead, he saw knowing smiles and nods of appreciation. In their own ways, many of them had been helping others through the hard times too. It was what communities did. They found ways to grow together, even in the hardest soil. The first sign of trouble came with the early autumn frost. Marcus woke to find his garden covered in a thin layer of white, unusually early for the season. His experienced eyes quickly assessed the damage. Most of his hardy vegetables had survived, but the more delicate plants showed signs of stress. The tomatoes he'd been counting on for the Henderson family's weekly delivery were particularly affected. Inside his garden shed, Marcus checked the weather forecast on his old tablet. A sustained, cold snap was moving in, threatening to cut the growing season short by several weeks. He thought about the families who depended on his vegetables both at the farmer's market and through his quiet deliveries. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as the community was beginning to rally around the future vertical farming project, nature reminded everyone why food security was so precarious. "Mr. Chen," Jenny's voice carried across the frosted garden. She hurried through the rows, her college backpack bouncing against her shoulder. "Have you seen the forecast? Professor Williams says this could be the start of an unusually harsh winter." Marcus nodded, his mind already calculating how to protect his remaining crops. "The ground temperature dropped faster than expected. We'll need to harvest what we can and set up cold frames for the rest." But Jenny's worried expression suggested more than just concern about the weather. "There's something else," she said, pulling out her laptop. "The local news just reported that there might be delays with the Green Future project." She opened a news article showing pictures of the old manufacturing plant. A group of protesters stood outside, holding signs that opposed the modernization plans. The article detailed concerns about water usage, energy consumption, and the impact on traditional farming in the region. Some of the older farmers from outside town are worried the vertical farming facility will put them out of business, Jenny explained. They're filing complaints with the town council, saying it's not natural, that it'll destroy traditional agriculture in the valley. Marcus felt the weight of conflict settling over his shoulders. He understood both sides, the desperate need for innovation and jobs in Pine Valley, but also the legitimate concerns of traditional farmers who had worked the land for generations. It was the same tension he felt in his own garden, balancing old methods with new possibilities. The morning's challenges weren't over. Tom Henderson arrived at the garden, his face drawn with worry. "Sarah had another bad attack last night," he said, helping Marcus cover sensitive plants against the frost. "The cold air triggered it. The hospital bills." He trailed off, his hands working mechanically with the protective sheets. "I was really counting on that maintenance position at the new facility." More visitors arrived throughout the morning, each bringing news that added to the growing sense of crisis. Mrs. Rodriguez had heard rumors that the project might be scaled back, eliminating the community teaching kitchen she'd hoped to run. Mike Patterson worried that the training programs would be postponed, leaving former plant workers in limbo for another winter. Catherine arrived around noon, her usual professional composure showing signs of strain. "I won't sugarcoat it," she said, gathering everyone in the garden shed. "We're facing some significant obstacles. The opposition from traditional farmers has spooked some investors, They're suggesting we scale back the community integration aspects of the project, focus purely on production. The shed fell silent as the implications sank in. The vision of a facility that would blend traditional wisdom with modern innovation, that would provide opportunities for everyone from experienced plant workers to children with health challenges, seemed to be slipping away. Sarah, who had come to the garden after school, clutched her inhaler tightly. "But what about the clean air growing spaces?" she asked in a small voice. "And Dad's job?" Marcus watched the hope drain from faces that had only recently begun to shine with possibility. The frost had done more than damage his plants. It threatened to freeze the warmth of community renewal that had been growing in Pine Valley. But as he looked around his garden, at the plants that had survived countless challenges over the years, an idea began to form. His father had always said that the strongest plants were those that faced adversity early, developing deep roots and resilient stems. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "this is not just a challenge but an opportunity. A chance to show how traditional and modern methods can truly work together." He turned to Catherine. "When is the next town council meeting?" "Tomorrow evening," she replied. "The traditional farmers will be presenting their concerns." "Good," Marcus nodded. "Because I think it's time for Pine Valley to show what community-supported agriculture really means." He looked at each person in the shed. Tom with his engineering skills, Jenny with her academic knowledge, Mrs. Rodriguez with her culinary expertise, Sarah with her dreams of a future where her health didn't limit her choices. We've been talking about combining old and new, about preserving tradition while embracing innovation. Now it's time to prove it can work. The frost might have damaged his garden, but Marcus knew that sometimes the harshest conditions brought out the best in both plants and people. The seeds of change they'd planted in Pine Valley would need everyone's help to survive this unexpected winter. The town hall meeting room hadn't been this full since the announcement of the manufacturing plant's closure 2 years ago. Marcus sat quietly in the middle row, observing the diverse group that had gathered. On one side sat the traditional farmers from the outlying valleys, their weathered faces showing generations of agricultural experience. On the other, former plant workers and Pine Valley residents filled the seats, many wearing the buttons Jenny had hastily designed. Growing together, traditional wisdom, modern solutions. But it was the unexpected arrival that caught everyone's attention. Just before the meeting began, a group of people entered the hall, led by an elderly Asian man whose presence caused Marcus to stand up in surprise. Dr. James Liu, his former professor from Agricultural College, now a renowned expert in sustainable farming practices, walked with the same purposeful stride Marcus remembered from 40 years ago. "Your letter was very compelling, Jenny," Dr. Liu said, nodding to his former student. Jenny beamed with pride. She had reached out to her university connections without telling anyone, building support for Pine Valley's innovation. Behind Dr. Liu stood representatives from successful community farming projects across the country, each ready to share their experiences of blending traditional and modern methods. Catherine moved quickly to accommodate the unexpected allies, rearranging the meeting's agenda. As she did, Marcus noticed another significant arrival. Through the side door, helped by his daughter, came Harold Miller, the eldest of the opposing farmers. Despite his public stance against the vertical farming project, Marcus caught the old farmer watching Sarah Henderson use her inhaler, his expression softening with understanding. The meeting began with the traditional farmers presenting their concerns. Harold Miller spoke for the group, his voice carrying decades of agricultural wisdom. "This land has provided for our families for generations," he said. "We've weathered droughts, floods, and changing markets, but this factory farming could destroy everything we've built." Instead of defensive reactions, Catherine surprised everyone by inviting Harold to examine the detailed plans for the facility. "Mr. Miller, would you look at these designs? They were actually inspired by traditional farming wisdom." She spread out blueprints showing how the vertical systems incorporated principles of crop rotation, companion planting, and seasonal timing, all adapted for indoor growing. Dr. Liu stepped forward, his academic authority lending weight to the discussion. "I've studied agricultural transitions worldwide," he explained. "The most successful projects don't replace traditional farming. They complement it. Think of it as adding another field to your farm, one that operates when outdoor growing is impossible." Tom Henderson, finding courage in the support of his community, stood to share his perspective. "I was skeptical too," he admitted to the farmers. "But look at what we've already accomplished by combining our different knowledge." He described how his manufacturing experience had helped improve irrigation systems in Marcus's garden, how traditional growing wisdom had enhanced the efficiency of their container gardens. Sarah, sitting with other children from the science club, raised her hand. "Can I show them my project?" At Catherine's nod, she walked to the front, her inhaler clutched in one hand, her carefully prepared presentation in the other. With remarkable poise, she demonstrated how the controlled environment of vertical farming could make agriculture accessible to children like her who couldn't work in traditional fields. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. Harold Miller, who had started the meeting opposing the project, found himself in a detailed discussion with Tom about how traditional soil preparation techniques could be adapted for hydroponic growing. Mrs. Rodriguez and several farm wives exchanged recipes and ideas for maintaining authentic flavors in greenhouse-grown vegetables. Marcus watched it all unfold, remembering how his own father had initially resisted the changes that modernization brought to their village in Taiwan. But just as his father had eventually discovered that new methods could preserve old traditions, he saw the farmers beginning to understand that this wasn't about replacement, it was about adaptation and growth. Dr. Liu made his way to Marcus's side. "Your student Jenny told me what you've been doing here," he said quietly. "The weekly vegetable deliveries, the garden workshops, the community building. You've created something special, a bridge between past and future." The meeting continued well past its scheduled end time, evolving from formal presentations into small group discussions. Farmers who had arrived ready to fight found themselves sharing growing tips with former factory workers. Catherine's team rapidly took notes, incorporating suggestions from both traditional and industrial perspectives into their plans. As the evening wound down, Harold Miller approached Marcus. "Your garden," he said gruffly, "the one that's been helping folks through hard times. Would you be willing to show me how you're managing those heritage tomato varieties? My greenhouse could use some improvements before winter sets in." Looking around the room, Marcus saw new connections forming, like roots spreading through fertile soil. Dr. Liu's presence had added legitimacy to their plans, while Sarah's presentation had put a human face on the need for agricultural innovation. The seeds of compromise were beginning to sprout, promising a harvest that could feed both tradition and progress. The morning after the town hall meeting, Marcus's garden became host to an unlikely gathering. Harold Miller arrived early, his truck pulling up just as Marcus was beginning his daily harvest. Following close behind was Dr. Liu, who had postponed his return to the university, sensing that something remarkable was unfolding in Pine Valley. "You've done more than grow vegetables here," Dr. Liu observed, running his hands through the soil Marcus had spent years enriching. "You've grown hope." He pulled out a small notebook, weathered and familiar, the same type he had required all his students to keep 40 years ago. Harold Miller knelt despite his arthritic knees to examine the heritage tomato plants that had survived the frost. "These are brandy wines," he said with surprise. "My grandfather used to grow these, haven't seen them done right in years." "They were my wife Mai's favorite," Marcus explained, carefully harvesting the remaining frost-hardy vegetables. "She always said the old varieties had the best stories to tell." He paused, remembering how Mai had insisted on saving seeds from their first garden in America, maintaining a connection to their past while building their future. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine and her team, including several architects and agricultural specialists. They spread their updated plans across a folding table, now incorporating suggestions from both the traditional farmers and the former factory workers. "We've been doing some research," Catherine began, but Harold cut her off with a raised hand. "Before we get to that," the old farmer said, "there's something you should know." He pulled out an old photograph from his jacket pocket. This was my father's farm, back in 1960. The image showed a vast field of vegetables and in the background a familiar figure. Marcus leaned closer, his breath catching. "That's my father," he said softly. "He worked several farms when we first arrived in America." Harold nodded. "Your father taught mine about intensive growing techniques from Taiwan, helped us double our yield that year." He looked around the garden. "Guess we've come full circle, with your garden helping our community again." Dr. Liu smiled knowingly. "In my 40 years of teaching agricultural science, I've learned that farming is as much about relationships as it is about crops." Marcus was one of my first students to truly understand that. The revelation sparked a deeper discussion about the integration of traditional farming wisdom with modern innovations. Tom Henderson arrived with detailed sketches of hybrid growing systems that combined conventional greenhouse techniques with vertical farming technology. Sarah followed, proudly showing Dr. Liu her science project about controlled environment agriculture. "Look what we found in the old plant records," Tom said, spreading out faded blueprints. The manufacturing facility was originally built on what used to be part of the Miller farm. The deed includes a provision about maintaining agricultural use of the land. Catherine's eyes lit up. "That's perfect. It strengthens our proposal to convert the facility for agricultural purposes." She turned to Harold. "Would you be willing to serve on our advisory board? We need someone with deep understanding of the land's history." As they talked, Jenny arrived with an unexpected guest, her professor of agricultural economics. "The university is interested in establishing a research partnership," she announced. "They want to study how traditional farming knowledge can enhance modern agricultural technology." The morning unfolded with more revelations. Mrs. Rodriguez discovered that her grandmother had once worked in Harold's family's farm kitchen, preserving vegetables for winter. The recipes she'd been protecting had roots in both the immigrant and farming communities of Pine Valley. Lisa Henderson, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "The library archives," she said. "I've been digitizing old agricultural records, and I found something interesting." She pulled out her tablet, showing photographs of Pine Valley's first community garden, started by immigrants and local farmers working together during hard times. "History doesn't just repeat," Marcus mused. "It grows. Like plants, it needs both old roots and new branches." He watched as Sarah showed Harold how her father's container garden design could be adapted for his greenhouse, while Tom and Catherine's engineers discussed incorporating traditional ventilation techniques into the vertical farming system. Dr. Liu pulled Marcus aside. "You remember what I taught about sustainable agriculture? It's not just about maintaining the soil, it's about maintaining the community that tends it." He gestured to the diverse group working together in the garden. "This is real sustainability." Centimer. The morning's discoveries had done more than reveal connections. They had planted seeds of understanding between different generations, traditions, and visions of the future. The garden had become a place where past and present could grow together, nurturing possibilities that neither could achieve alone. As the group continued their discussions, Marcus noticed Sarah writing in a small notebook, the same type he and Dr. Liu had used years ago. "What are you recording?" he asked. "Everything," she said earnestly. "For the future. So they'll know how Pine Valley learned to grow in new ways without forgetting the old ones." Marcus smiled, recognizing in her words the same wisdom that had guided his weekly vegetable deliveries. The understanding that helping others grow was the surest way to grow yourself. As news of the historical connections between Pine Valley's farming and immigrant communities spread, Marcus found himself spending more time sharing stories than tending plants. His garden had become a living archive of community memory, with people bringing old photographs, recipes, and farming journals to add to the growing collection of local agricultural history. One quiet afternoon, as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the garden beds, Harold Miller returned with a box of old documents he'd found in his barn. "Been meaning to organize these for years," he said, setting the box down carefully in Marcus's garden shed. "Figured now's the time, while we're all learning from each other." Inside the box, they discovered detailed records of crop rotations, weather patterns, and soil conditions dating back to the 1950s. But it was a series of letters that caught Marcus's attention. Correspondence between Harold's father and Marcus's own father, discussing agricultural techniques that blended American and Asian farming methods. "Your father never mentioned these letters," Harold said, watching Marcus read through them with trembling hands. "He wasn't one for talking about the past," Marcus replied softly. "He always said the future needed more attention than memories." He paused, remembering his father's quiet pride when Marcus had chosen to study agricultural science. But he kept everything, every lesson, every connection. Catherine arrived with Tom Henderson, carrying updated blueprints for the vertical farming facility. Tom's engineering background had proved invaluable in adapting traditional farming wisdom for modern applications. His confidence had grown with each successful innovation, and today he carried himself with the authority of someone who had found his purpose again. "We've incorporated the ventilation principles from Harold's grandfather's greenhouse design," Tom explained, spreading the plans across Marcus's workbench. "Combined with modern climate control systems, it's more efficient than either method alone." Sarah sat in her usual spot by the window working on her science project while the adults talked. Her inhaler lay unused beside her. The garden shed's new air filtration system, a prototype Tom had designed, allowed her to participate fully in garden activities for the first time. "Dad," she called out, "can I show them my new drawings? I've been thinking about the seedling room." Her father nodded encouragingly, and Sarah brought over her notebook. The pages were filled with detailed sketches combining traditional greenhouse layouts with vertical growing spaces, all designed to be accessible for children with respiratory issues. "You've got your father's eye for design," Catherine noted, examining Sarah's work, "and your mother's attention to detail." Lisa, who had arrived with more library archives, smiled at the comparison. Her careful research had uncovered countless connections between Pine Valley's agricultural past and its potential future. Jenny burst into the shed, her university textbooks clutched to her chest. "Dr. Liu's proposal got approved," she announced breathlessly. "The university wants to establish a research station here, studying the integration of traditional and modern farming methods. They're offering scholarships for local students interested in agricultural science." The news sparked a flurry of discussion. Mrs. Rodriguez began sharing her grandmother's preserved recipes, explaining how traditional food preservation techniques could be adapted for produce from the vertical farming facility. "The flavors of home," she said. "They need to carry forward, no matter how we grow the ingredients." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus noticed how each person in the shed represented a different aspect of Pine Valley's story. Harold, with his generations of farming knowledge. Tom, bridging industrial expertise and agricultural innovation. Sarah, embodying the community's future potential. Jenny, connecting academic research with practical application. Dr. Liu, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "Marcus, do you remember what I taught about agricultural ecosystems, how every element depends on the others?" He gestured to the gathered group. "You've created something similar here. A human ecosystem where different kinds of knowledge and experience support each other." The observation struck Marcus deeply. He thought about his weekly vegetable deliveries to the Henderson family, how that simple act of caring had grown into something far more significant. Just as his garden demonstrated how different plants could support each other's growth, the community was showing how different traditions and approaches could strengthen one another. Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Chen," she said, "I've been reading about your father in these old letters. He wrote that sometimes the best way to preserve tradition is to help it grow in new ways." She looked around the shed, at the mixture of old farming journals and new technical drawings. "That's what we're doing, isn't it?" Marcus nodded, remembering Mai's words about gardens being places where past and future could grow together. The vegetables he grew might feed bodies, but it was the connections growing alongside them that nourished the community's spirit. As evening approached, Harold turned to Marcus with an unexpected question. "Those Thursday morning deliveries you've been making," he said quietly. "Would you mind some company next week? My fields produced more than I can sell, and I know some families who could use fresh vegetables." The offer represented more than just additional food for struggling families. It was a bridge between Pine Valley's agricultural past and its innovative future, proving that the most valuable growth wasn't always visible in the soil. The first snow of winter dusted Pine Valley just as Green Future Enterprises called an important community meeting. The old manufacturing plant's conference room, recently cleaned and heated for the occasion, filled quickly with an eclectic mix of people: traditional farmers in sturdy work boots, former factory workers in well-worn jackets, university researchers with their laptops, and families eager to hear about the project's next phase. Catherine stood at the front of the room, flanked by corporate executives who had flown in specifically for this announcement. Marcus sat between Harold Miller and Tom Henderson, noting how the room's energy crackled with anticipation. Sarah Henderson perched on her father's knee, clutching the inhaler she rarely needed now, thanks to Tom's air filtration innovations. "What we're announcing today," Catherine began, "goes beyond our original plans for Pine Valley." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing an aerial view of the old manufacturing plant and surrounding land. "Thanks to the incredible community involvement and the unexpected synergies we've discovered, Green Future Enterprises is expanding its vision." The room hushed as she continued. "We're not just building a vertical farming facility. We're creating the National Center for Agricultural Innovation and Heritage." The next slide showed architectural renderings of a dramatically transformed space. This will be the first facility of its kind, combining cutting-edge vertical farming technology with traditional agricultural wisdom. Tom straightened in his seat as Catherine detailed the technical aspects. The facility would feature multiple growing environments, from state-of-the-art vertical farming systems to traditional greenhouse spaces. His designs for adaptive growing systems had been incorporated throughout the plans, with special attention to accessibility and air quality control. "The center will serve multiple purposes," Catherine explained: production, research, education, and community support. She gestured to Dr. Liu, who stood to address the group. "The university's involvement has attracted significant additional funding. We'll be offering research opportunities, training programs, and educational initiatives for everyone from experienced farmers to school children." Harold Miller raised his hand. "What about the traditional farming knowledge?" "The techniques that have sustained this valley for generations," Catherine smiled. "That's where you come in, Mr. Miller. We want to create a living agricultural heritage program, documenting and preserving traditional farming methods while exploring how they can enhance modern techniques." She clicked to a slide showing plans for demonstration gardens that would combine historical farming practices with contemporary innovations. Mrs. Rodriguez gasped when Catherine revealed plans for a culinary heritage center. "We want to ensure that traditionally grown foods remain part of our community's future," Catherine explained. "The center will include teaching kitchens where traditional recipes and preservation methods can be passed down and adapted for modern growing techniques." Jenny could barely contain her excitement as Catherine announced the scholarship program. Green Future Enterprises, in partnership with the university, will provide full scholarships for local students pursuing degrees in agricultural science, engineering, or related fields. The first recipient has already been chosen. All eyes turned to Jenny, who blushed as Catherine acknowledged her role in bringing the university and community together. But it was the next announcement that brought tears to many eyes. "We're establishing the Chen Miller Community Growing Initiative," Catherine revealed. Inspired by Marcus Chen's quiet acts of kindness and Harold Miller's generational farming wisdom, this program will ensure that fresh, locally grown produce reaches every family in need, year-round. Sarah tugged at her father's sleeve as Catherine showed designs for the Children's Discovery Center, The plans included specialized growing spaces with controlled environments where children with respiratory issues could safely participate in hands-on agricultural activities. Tom pulled his daughter close, remembering the days when she could only watch others garden from a distance. "But here's the most important part," Catherine continued. "This center belongs to all of you. We're establishing a community oversight board to ensure it serves local needs and preserves local values." She began listing positions that needed to be filled: traditional farming advisor, technical innovation director, community outreach coordinator, educational program director. Marcus watched as his neighbors straightened in their seats, seeing themselves in these roles. Tom Henderson's engineering expertise made him perfect for the technical innovation position. Harold Miller's deep agricultural knowledge would be invaluable as traditional farming advisor. Jenny's connection to academia and the community suited her for educational program director. And for the position of executive director, Catherine paused, turning to Marcus. "We would be honored if you would consider taking the role, Mr. Chen. Your ability to bridge different growing methods, generations, and communities is exactly what this center needs to thrive." The offer hung in the air like a seed waiting to take root. Marcus looked around the room at the faces of people he'd watched grow in different ways over the past months. The former factory workers who had found new purpose in agricultural technology. The traditional farmers who had discovered how their knowledge could shape the future. The children, like Sarah, who could now dream of careers in agriculture regardless of health challenges. He thought about his father's letters, about Mai's belief in gardens as places of connection, about the simple act of sharing vegetables that had sparked this transformation. The center represented everything they had believed in: the importance of feeding both bodies and communities, of preserving wisdom while embracing innovation. As Marcus stood to respond, he realized that just as his garden had grown from a retirement project into a community cornerstone, Pine Valley was growing into something none of them had imagined possible. The seeds of kindness he had planted with those first vegetable deliveries were about to bloom into something extraordinary. The weeks following the announcement saw Pine Valley transform in ways both visible and subtle. The old manufacturing plant buzzed with activity as construction crews began the renovation work, guided by Tom Henderson's expertise in combining industrial systems with agricultural needs. The winter weather couldn't dampen the community's enthusiasm as they watched their shared vision take physical form. Marcus found himself balancing multiple roles during this transition period. Each morning still began in his garden, maintaining the rhythms that had sustained the community through difficult times. But now he was rarely alone. Harold Miller often joined him at dawn, their conversations mixing agricultural wisdom with plans for the center's Living Heritage program. "Look at this," Harold said one morning, showing Marcus a series of old notebooks he'd discovered. "My grandfather's records of companion planting methods. He learned some of these techniques from your father." The two men worked together to adapt these traditional growing practices for the vertical farming systems, proving that old wisdom could enhance new technology. Inside the partially renovated facility, Sarah Henderson led tour groups of her classmates through the construction zones, proudly explaining how the air filtration systems her father designed would make agriculture accessible to children with respiratory issues. Her inhaler remained in her pocket, unused as she demonstrated the prototype growing spaces. "And here," she explained with the confidence of someone who had found her calling, "is where we'll have the Children's Discovery Center. Kids with asthma like me can learn about growing food without worrying about pollen or dust." Her teachers noted how she had blossomed from a quiet, often absent student into an passionate advocate for inclusive agriculture. Jenny split her time between university classes and helping develop the educational programs for the center. Her professors were impressed by how she integrated academic theory with practical community needs. "We're not just teaching agriculture," she explained during a planning session. "We're teaching community resilience." The community kitchen, still under construction, became Mrs. Rodriguez's domain. She worked with a team of local cooks to document traditional recipes and preservation methods, adapting them for produce grown using both conventional and vertical farming techniques. The flavors of home, she insisted, must taste the same whether the tomatoes grow up or down. Tom Henderson found himself in demand as other communities began hearing about Pine Valley's innovative approach. His designs for accessible growing spaces and adaptive agricultural equipment attracted attention from disability advocates and agricultural technology firms. The man who had struggled to find work now had to turn down consulting offers to focus on the center's development. Lisa Henderson's library research project expanded into a full-scale digital archive of agricultural history and innovation. "We're not just preserving the past," she explained to a visiting documentary crew. "We're showing how traditional knowledge shapes the future." The library became a hub where farmers shared growing tips with technology developers, each learning from the other's perspective. Catherine coordinated it all, ensuring that corporate objectives aligned with community needs. She had moved into a small apartment in Pine Valley, saying she needed to be close to the most exciting agricultural innovation project in the country. Her corporate executives were impressed by how the community's involvement had enhanced their original plans. But the transition wasn't without challenges. Marcus found himself mediating between different visions of the center's future. Some traditional farmers worried about preserving authentic growing methods, while technology advocates pushed for maximum efficiency. The solution often emerged from unexpected sources. "Remember what you taught us in biology class?" Jenny asked during one particularly tense meeting. "About how natural systems find balance through diversity?" She showed how their most successful growing experiments came from combining traditional wisdom with modern innovations, neither dominating but each enhancing the other. The winter weather posed its own challenges. Construction delays threatened to impact the spring growing season. But the community rallied, with Harold Miller offering his greenhouse space for starter plants and Tom Henderson adapting temporary growing spaces within the partially completed facility. Through it all, Marcus maintained his Thursday morning vegetable deliveries, though now with company. Harold Miller joined him regularly, along with other farmers who had begun similar practices in their neighborhoods. The simple act that had started everything continued, reminding everyone that, at its heart, their grand project was about feeding both bodies and spirits. Sarah captured the period's energy in her ongoing journal, which had grown from a science project into a chronicle of community transformation. "It's like Mr. Chen's garden," she wrote. "Some plants grow fast, some grow slow, but they all need good soil and careful tending. Our community is growing something new, but we're using the good soil of our history and traditions." As winter deepened, Marcus often ended his days in the garden shed, now insulated and expanded to serve as a temporary community meeting space. Surrounded by the mixing of old and new, traditional farming almanacs beside digital tablets, seed catalogs next to CAD drawings, he marveled at how his simple garden had become the seedbed for such transformation. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, he found Sarah adding to her journal. "What are you writing about today?" he asked. She looked up with a smile that reminded him of Mai. "About how helping others grow helps you grow too," she replied. "Like how you helped my family with vegetables and now everybody's helping everybody grow something bigger." Marcus nodded, understanding that the true harvest of his garden wasn't measured in vegetables, but in the hope and connection it had planted in their community. Spring arrived in Pine Valley with unprecedented vigor. The National Center for Agricultural Innovation and Heritage prepared for its grand opening, its gleaming surfaces and green walls standing as a testament to what communities can achieve when they grow together. The old manufacturing plant had been transformed into something that honored both progress and tradition, much like the community itself. Marcus stood in his original garden early that morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of promise. The garden beds were already alive with spring growth, but they were no longer just his responsibility. Community members had adopted various sections, learning from his methods while adding their own wisdom to the mix. Harold Miller pulled up in his truck right on schedule for their weekly vegetable delivery routine. But today was different. Behind him came a convoy of vehicles, other local farmers, former factory workers turned agricultural innovators, and families who had once received help and were now in a position to help others. Ready for the big day? Harold asked, helping Marcus load freshly harvested vegetables into delivery boxes. They had expanded their delivery route over the months, creating a network of support that reached far beyond Pine Valley. What had started with Marcus's solitary acts of kindness had grown into a community-wide movement. Sarah Henderson arrived with her family, no longer the shy girl struggling with asthma, but a confident young leader in the center's youth program. She carried her ever-present journal, its pages now filled with both scientific observations and the stories of Pine Valley's transformation. "Mr. Chen," she called out excitedly, "wait until you see the Children's Discovery Center. The air filtration system Dad designed works perfectly. We tested it yesterday with my whole class." Tom smiled proudly, remembering how far they'd come from their early experiments with container gardens on their apartment balcony. The morning unfolded like a carefully tended garden, each element contributing to the whole. Jenny led a group of university students through the vertical farming sections, explaining how traditional growing wisdom enhanced their modern methods. Mrs. Rodriguez directed final preparations in the Culinary Heritage Center, where the aroma of traditional recipes made with hydroponically grown ingredients filled the air. Dr. Liu arrived with a delegation of agricultural experts from around the world, eager to study Pine Valley's unique approach to combining traditional and modern farming methods. "This is more than just a facility," he told the visitors. "It's a model for how communities can preserve their agricultural heritage while embracing innovation." Catherine gathered everyone in the center's main atrium for the final preparations before the official opening. The space beautifully represented their shared vision. Living walls of vegetables grew alongside historical farming exhibits, while transparent panels showed the vertical farming operations in action. Traditional hand tools hung beside modern agricultural technology, each with stories to tell. "Before we open the doors," Catherine announced, "there's one more thing we need to reveal." She nodded to Lisa Henderson, who had been coordinating with the town's historical society. Lisa unveiled a permanent exhibition dedicated to the story of Pine Valley's agricultural renaissance. The exhibition began with photographs of Marcus's original garden and the first mysterious vegetable deliveries. It continued through the community's journey, the formation of unlikely friendships, the blending of old and new knowledge, the transformation of crisis into opportunity. At its center was a reproduction of the letters between Marcus's father and Harold's father, showing how cooperation and shared wisdom had helped the community thrive before. "This isn't just history," Lisa explained. "It's a living story that keeps growing." As the doors opened to welcome the public, Marcus watched generations of Pine Valley residents mingle with visitors from around the world. Sarah led tours of the children's areas, her inhaler forgotten in her pocket as she moved confidently through the controlled environments. Tom demonstrated the adaptive growing systems he had designed, while Harold shared traditional farming wisdom in the Heritage Center. Jenny proudly showed off the university research partnership programs, now attracting students from across the country. Mrs. Rodriguez's cooking demonstrations proved that traditionally inspired meals could be created with innovatively grown ingredients. Every corner of the facility buzzed with the energy of growth and possibility. But what touched Marcus most deeply was watching families receive their vegetable deliveries, now a formal program named the Chen Miller Community Growing Initiative. The program had expanded beyond just providing food. It now included education, job training, and community support, all while maintaining the dignity of those it served. As the day drew to a close, Marcus found himself back in his original garden. Sarah sat nearby, making final entries in her journal about the opening day. "Mr. Chen," she said thoughtfully, "remember when you told me that sometimes the smallest seeds grow into the biggest changes?" Marcus nodded, thinking about how his simple decision to help one family had grown into something that transformed an entire community. The National Center was more than just a building or a program. It was proof that when people nurtured both traditions and innovations, both wisdom and progress, remarkable things could grow. That evening, as the sun set on Pine Valley's new chapter, Marcus looked out over the center's green walls and garden spaces. Somewhere, he felt sure, Mai was smiling at how their shared love of growing things had blossomed into such an extraordinary harvest of hope and community renewal. In the end, he said softly to Sarah, who was still writing in her journal, the greatest thing we can grow is not vegetables or buildings or programs. It's the connections between people, the way we help each other grow into something more than we imagined possible. Sarah nodded, adding his words to her journal. Another seed of wisdom planted for future generations to discover and grow in their own ways. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.